All right, fantastic. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Uncertainty for Uncertain Times, adapting random number generation to broaden appeal and improve accessibility. Before we get into the talk, obviously we have some elephants in the room to address. When I first pitched this talk, I was still a technical designer, senior technical designer at League of Geeks. Looking forward to a long live support period on Solium Infernum, leveraging all those wonderful spreadsheets I showed you last year. Unfortunately, that did not come to pass, as we can see in this artist's impression. I have been to GCAP now 3 times. The name at the bottom of my lanyard has never been the same twice in a row. I've been laid off twice since COVID because funding keeps being pulled and studios keep closing. And I consider myself one of the lucky ones because I've landed on my feet, more or less. So I think we need to take a moment to acknowledge that we are, well, many people are suffering in our industry and, yeah, I mean, look after each other kind of thing. Yeah. That all being said, who am I? Hello, I'm William. I've been working in games for about a decade now, mostly as an AI and systems designer, mostly on turn-based strategy titles. So the Endless series, Humankind, and obviously Solium, which is still Open Critics' Australian Game of 2024. Take that, Kill Knight. For now. Yeah, I'm now working as a kind of technical content designer at Twice Different on Winnie's Hole, this wonderful game here, which is a kind of deck-building roguelike game, a bit like Slay the Spire, but with Winnie and the Thing. And I'm also working as a design consultant at a bunch of different places, including Amplitude once again, also Studio Muji on Bonaparte Mechanized Revolution, which just released its Next Fest demo, so you can go and play that. And also Studio Rookies and various other places. So yeah, I've mostly been working on strategy games. As a result, this chart obviously scared me a little. Who's familiar with this chart? Yeah, so this was released by Quantic Foundry in, I think it was May. And it tracks kind of player interest in strategy, which is thinking ahead and making decisions. So I wanted to talk to this a little bit. First of all, we kind of need to put this into perspective. So this is the decline that we're actually talking about. It's from about 50 to 35% over 9 years. And I'd like to say kind of first of all, like we know that kind of hype cycles exist over a longer period than that. So what we may be witnessing is kind of the tail end of a cycle of interest in this type of game. And I'm going to put a few of the games that I'll be talking about today on the graph here. We have the original Solium Infernum that I was working on a remake of when this talk was submitted in 2009. I think most people will have heard of XCOM Enemy Unknown that came out in 2012. And I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Armello that came out in 2015. And actually both League of Geeks and Amplitude Studios were founded in 2011, actually on the same day, which is also the founder's birthday of Amplitude, random fact. So yeah, we had a bit of a moment for turn-based strategy, as we had a moment for real-time strategy in the 90s. Another way of looking at this is the economy is stupid. Now this is a recession prediction model based on yield spreads. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to go into exactly what that means. But essentially, we are living objectively in a period of economic difficulty, and it's probably not that much of a stretch of the imagination to assume that when people are in a period of difficulty, they are less interested in difficulty and hardship within the games they're playing. They want to relax. And that may explain to an extent the rise in kind of cozy games that we've experienced recently. And if I put Dark Souls here, so we can see it kind of appeared in this trough. Now, obviously, you can correlate the decline of the number of pirates with global warming. People have. So correlation is not causation. But it's kind of interesting to stack these kind of bits of data on top of each other. And of course, Solium was described in marketing as the Dark Souls of strategy games. So, yeah. But all this being said, is this actually even consistent with sales data? Like Quantic Foundry is using survey data, and it may just be that what people perceive as strategy, quote unquote, is changing over time, right? And obviously Baldur's Gate 3 came out last year and was extremely successful, and that is very much a game of thinking ahead and making decisions. Although I'm not going to claim that the strategy elements of that game were the reason why it was successful. Like, obviously, D&D had a little impact on it. So kind of ultimately, is this chart a cause for moral panic? The way it was presented was kind of, cuts in films are getting shorter and shorter, attention spans are dropping. Kids these days, they're all looking at their smartphones. They have no attention, we're all doomed. And obviously, we can sort of put the invention of the iPhone there and be like, since the iPhone, since social media, it's all gone to the dogs. Panic. It's very tempting to panic in situations like these. And that's not really what I want to talk about in itself. I want to talk about why it's tempting to panic. So I've been reading Tom Holland's Dominion recently, which is about the West and about Christianity. And there's this foundational myth that we have, which is that of the fall we saw depicted on the previous slide. This idea that there was an Edenic past, there was a moment where everything was hunky-dory, and then it all fell apart. And we've seen over the course of the history of the West various crisis moments and reformations, the Catholic Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the communist revolutions throughout Russia and various other countries. And so this idea that things are falling apart and we need to rebuild them it's a very tempting narrative to apply to, well, everything. And interestingly, I really want to speak to some of the FreeCon talks because this sort of taps into them as well, but there's a kind of omerta around that. Games tap into this idea too. So games, in a sense, promise a return to this Edenic state that we feel that we've lost. They promise clear objectives and feedback. They promise just rewards in a world where often we don't have either of these things, where we try very hard, we just can't buy a house, especially if we work in games. And you might think that I am overdoing it with this whole kind of religious theology thing in a game design talk, but Exhibit A, who's heard of karmic dice in Baldur's Gate 3? Yeah, so look up this option. It is on by default. So by default, the Baldur's Gate 3 system is imposing justice on cruel and uncaring randomness. Is this why the game was successful, or is it because of the D&D license? I'll leave that question to the audience. But obviously I can't talk about everything today, so I'm just going to be talking about karmic dice, aka smart random, aka D-rages. So yeah, I've said times are hard for devs, times are harder for players. To be a game developer is already to be extremely lucky. We're lucky to be able to work in games. And so at times of hardship, we need to be thinking about where we can remove unnecessary, and I say unnecessary friction. Friction can be an important part of the game's aesthetic, as we will see. But yeah, it's more vital than ever. There's a wonderful Steve Krug quote from the book, Don't Make Me Think. On the internet, the competition is just one click away, and so if you frustrate users, they'll head somewhere else. Well, on Steam, the competition is just one refund away at all times. And as I've said, I'm not going to be talking about everything today because I've only got 40 minutes. So I will be talking about randomized systems in particular and how they can cause friction. I'm going to give an example outside of games, which is kind of the iPod shuffle algorithm. A lot of people are frustrated when they get the same genre, the same artist twice in a row. That's random, baby. But you can't just say to players, that's random, baby. You are responsible for the output of your systems, right? And that means that you need to have an understanding of how random works, and you need to master fate. What's that Warcraft 3 quote? Sometimes the hand of fate must be forced. The most edgelord thing in the world. I see that Alex is in the room today. This is for you, Alex. This isn't just a UX problem, right? Avoiding friction. If your game system is inherently frustrating, no amount of UX design is going to fix that. You are responsible for the underlying system, and this is why this example particularly appeals to me. That output of the shuffle is coming from the system itself. It's not coming from any level of presentation, right? A big part of this talk is going to be about Solium Infernum, or I'm going to be using examples from Solium Infernum because it's one of the things I've been working on recently. Also jokes. So what is Solium Infernum? The original was released, as I said, in 2009. It was a very niche, very difficult to get into play-by-email strategy game. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with web diplomacy, but that's probably the closest thing to it. If you're not familiar with diplomacy, it's basically like Risk, but everyone is taking their turns simultaneously, and so there's ample opportunity to sort of promise you'll do something and then not do that. And what Solium added on top of that was an awful lot of dice rolls, an awful lot of randomised systems, and these kind of, and again, I talked about unnecessary or necessary friction. These did help sell the aesthetic of like a Kafkaesque, capricious, unfair vision of hell. Like there was an event that could occur that would just wipe your army off the map called Capricious Wrath. Yeah, it sucks. It's hell. That's hell, baby. Maybe not well suited to 2024. And yet, you would think, but the remake did release in February to universal critical acclaim, did really, really well. It did reasonably well commercially. I would say we probably overinvested a little bit. But it did well both commercially and critically. And so today I'm going to be talking or giving various examples about like how we adapted what was an extremely capricious and unfair game at times into something that was a little bit more accessible, a little bit more fair, without losing that kind of feeling of hellishness. All right, so to do that, we're going to have to define some things. So I talked about a situational approach to uncertainty. What do I mean by situational? This comes from Brian Upton's The Aesthetic of Play, which I'm a huge fanboy of, this idea of game situations. I think Dinosaur Polo Club gave a talk yesterday about moments. But basically it's this idea of like you have a moment of agency in your game. Like a canonical example would be I'm playing Reigns. I have this kind of Tinder-esque yes-no question. Like, I could be the executioner. And this has various clear consequences, right? So that's a game situation. But equally, this isn't just a turn-based strategy game type concept, right? A real-time game like Doom, like who here has played Doom? Excellent. So like you look at this screenshot and you can almost feel yourself in that agentic space, where you're like, gotta jump to the left here. Or like, probably chain gun is a good weapon, but maybe I have a plasma gun. You have these various kind of discrete options that are popping into your mind when you see this screenshot, right? And so in a sense, a real-time game is a series of game situations, right? And seen in that manner, basically a game is a random or a procedural generator of game situations, right? The system is generating game situations on the fly, much like a dungeon master improvising situations that players might find themselves in. So it's like, it's all PCG, And obviously you can also script your game situations by hand, like if you're making a choose your own adventure book, or if you're making something in Twine, you'll be like handcrafting those game situations. And this idea has important implications for prototyping, because you can kind of test the kind of situations that you want to be putting your player in via the system as kind of like little Twine games. And that can be a useful way of kind of smoke checking whether they feel impactful and interesting without developing a whole game system to generate them. Upton's book, which again I would recommend, also gives a bunch of different heuristics to evaluate game situations. So these are variety. I need to be obviously encountering different situations. If I'm only ever encountering this situation here over and over again, it's not going to be very interesting. I need to have different choices, different options within the situations that I am encountering. There need to be different solutions. There need to be consequences. So, my choices need to actually lead somewhere else. Looking at you, Mass Effect. satisfaction, there need to be satisfactory outcomes need to be possible to find within this possibility space. And then predictability and uncertainty, which I almost group together as a sort of, we need a balance of these two, right? It needs to be possible to predict what the outcome of my choice is, but not too possible. I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on this kind of uncertainty, predictability, conflict, or yin-yang, if you will, the dance between the two of them. It's important to breathe sometimes. All right, so uncertainty. Let's talk a bit more about that. To me, uncertainty is an important factor in separating play from grind. The difference between rote data entry and playing with the numbers when we are tuning our variables is not knowing what the consequence is going to be, right? You're playing when you're kind of like, oh, what if I did this? That would be interesting. But like if you've already decided what the numbers are all going to be, you're just kind of plumbing them all in, and it's just grind. It's just work, right? So the epistemological cycle exists both within the context of playing, but also work, if you're doing something interesting at work. Ralph Koster's book, A Theory of Fun, talks about this in a much more sort of lighthearted and I says accessible way. Brian Upton is very highbrow, and I like highbrow. I like to use long words like epistemological and induction. So there are kind of three steps in the epistemological cycle. There is induction, that is generalizing something that we have accepted as a fact in our model. So for instance, this cacodemon isn't much of a threat. So I'm going to generalize this and say, well, nothing that floats around with one eye is much of a threat. Then from that generalized rule, I can deduce that this thing that's kind of eye floaty thing, that thing is also not much of a threat. And then I test my hypothesis. Unfortunately, this is a different version of PowerPoint, so my testing. So then I test, and this is what is commonly known as playing. But for me, playing is all of this, right? The stuff that's going on in your head is play. When you're watching a game trailer and you're playing the game in your head, that is play, right? So being a strategy designer, I'm putting all the cerebral stuff big and red, and all the hand stuff is a little over here. Keith Bergen calls this labor, but I think that's a little bit too derogatory. We test our hypothesis, we interact with the system. And then we have abduction, which is a weird one. If you're familiar with Wordle or Mastermind, this is kind of the process of looking at what the system has told you was wrong and then trying to find a new model that fits that. And then we get back to induction and we go round and round and round. And the process of turning the crank of the epistemological cycle creates the nice brain juice that make feel good, right? Where does uncertainty come into this equation? Well, essentially, the less uncertainty we have, the further we can plan ahead. So if there's no uncertainty at all, I can effectively plan out all my moves until the very end of the game, right? Theoretically. And what that does is it means that I end up with this huge kind of testing area where I'm just interacting, right? I'm just executing on my plan that is infinitely long. So longer plans mean more labor before we find out whether we were right. There's an interesting game developer article on Trudge talking about 4X games. I've worked on 4X games obviously quite a lot, but if anyone's played Civilization, there comes a moment often in the late game where I want to attack the Egyptians. That's my plan. But to do that, I have to click on like 70 different units and move them one by one. And I don't find out whether I was right to attack the Egyptians until I've done that. So there's a lot of labor before I get the next turn of the crank, right? Turning the crank becomes like... and also, it can lead to analysis paralysis. If we feel like we have to plan infinitely far ahead, then we're going to, be sitting there planning infinitely far ahead and never making decisions. Does this mean that we should just add more uncertainty? No, too much uncertainty, and you've probably experienced this, it just leads to button mashing. And that's like you're turning the crank, but it's not catching. It's just going round and round, nothing's coming out of it. So all of this is kind of both slightly obvious and slightly too highbrow. So I'll give you an example of how we actually applied this as a philosophy to Solium, the remake. In last year's talk, I mentioned the combat system. It's not really important for me to go into exactly how it works for this particular talk. Only there are an awful lot of dice, right? The original game rolled to determine the damage on each side. It rolled to determine whether different abilities activated. And that's both in the Legion fights and also the Predator dueling. There was a luck roll. There's dice everywhere. My name's William Dyce, by the way. Yeah, it's a nominative determinism there. But, as we've mentioned, the game is We Go. And if you've ever played like Colt Express or Robo Rally, you know that there's a lot of uncertainty that comes from not knowing what the other players are going to do. I should have mentioned this in the previous slide, actually, but like there are lots of different kinds of uncertainty out there. We tend to think of uncertainty as like random number generation, right? But, well, there's also, uncertainty of perception. Did I see what I thought I saw? There's uncertainty of execution, like am I going to be able to get the timing right? Am I going to be able to aim correctly? There's uncertainty due to ignorance of the game rules, like I don't actually know whether I'm allowed to do this or whether this will work. And then hidden information, like I don't know what's in this deck. I don't know the contents of the other player's mind, whether they trust me, whether they are suspicious, etc. And so all those forms of uncertainty exist in Solium. And, we kind of have enough already without also adding dice rolls on top of it. And so we basically removed them all from these systems. We felt that there was enough uncertainty already. And kind of the feeling was that the aesthetic wasn't one of being constantly kicked by the hellishness of hell. It was more one of mind games, right? That was what was ultimately really important in the game. And that mind game exists all the more if you are thinking about what the other players are going to do as opposed to taking a punt on whether a random roll will go your way, if that makes sense. So yeah, I guess the lesson here is think about the actual aesthetic of the game, like what you're actually trying to go for on an emotional level. And also like, do you need RNG actually in your system? Like it's kind of tempting, especially if you're making like, I don't know, I'm working on a few tactical games or like RPG type games. Like people have a tendency in their combat systems to just add RNG to results. It's worth thinking about like, do you actually need it? There's a great talk by Richard Garfield on uncertainty, where he goes a lot more into why you might want more uncertainty. So I'd recommend that on YouTube. It's a great leveler, like it's good for newer players because there's that difference in uncertainty of ignorance of rules, but everyone is subject to random. But yeah, think critically about whether you need RNG. So this talk would be very short if I was just saying, hey, just don't. Any questions? So let's assume that you are actually going to use some form of random number generation in your game. What are some kind of approaches that we can use to as I said, force the hand of fate? Please appreciate my jokes. If anyone gets that, I'm proud of you. So more definitions. What is a stochastic variable? I could have said random variable, but I want it to be a smarty pants. So it's a quantity or object that depends on RNG. Who has played Lethal Company? Awesome. So Lethal Company, we have this item over here called the inverse teleporter. The inverse teleporter will put you at a random position on the outpost of the moon that you're currently exploring, right? And so that is one example of a stochastic variable. You sample it and it gives you a position on a moon. And we say that the possible results that a variable can give is its domain. So for instance, different positions on a moon, but also like the moon itself is procedurally generated. So we can say that the moon comes from sampling a random variable. I'm just going to change hands because my left hand is getting tired. Also, what's in the store? Is there a boombox in the store? We find out by sampling a random variable or stochastic variable. Damn it. I wanted to use the fancy pants one. Stochastic more or less means random, but in the same way that I prefer to use procedural generation to random generation. Random seems like it's just uncontrolled, whereas procedural is more controlled. Stochastic, it is a process that involves randomness, but it is not purely random. So technically, it's a little bit more precise. And yeah, less than ideal situations can result from insufficiently constrained domains. What I mean by this, being teleported into a locked room is what I mean in Lethal Company. Now, this kind of works in Lethal Company because it's a comedy game. So we all laugh about it afterwards. Haha, I got stuck in the room. In the moment, you're like, oh, I guess I don't have any part in this run, except maybe vaguely yelling to be let out, which I guess is kind of funny. So, what are different approaches we can take to dealing with this kind of situation if it comes up in one of our games? Well, one of them is to define a set of failure conditions for a sample. So, for instance, we could calculate a path from a potential teleport destination when it's drawn to an exit. And if we can't find such a path, we roll again. We just re-roll it automatically. The issue with this is that we don't know how many times we're going to need to do that before we actually find a solution that works. If we set ourselves like a limit of, say, 5 tries, it's possible that the 5th result is the worst we've encountered yet, which is not ideal. So a kind of improvement on this would be also to associate a score with a given sample. So rather than just passing or failing, we can also give it like a level of passness. And then we remember all of the previous results that we've drawn, and we pick the one that's had the best results so far. Meta-heuristics. We can also define rules for locally tweaking samples to improve their scores. A concrete example of this would be in Endless Legend. We determine the start locations of the players, but then we check that there's a minimum quota of resource yields around that start location, and if there isn't, we kind of fudge it. Like we add extra like little anomalies over here and things to improve those yields. So yeah, even it's funny when you look into these like games that look really professional and you realize it's hacks all the way down. Stochastic local search, if you want to be a smarty pants about this. My preferred solution is what I call invariant properties. Essentially, like ideally, we wouldn't need to re-roll in the first place. We would just have constrained in advance the domain of our variables so that we can only ever get good results, in inverted commas. And this is harder because it requires you to kind of do your job as a designer and think about like what is a good result, what is a bad result. It's very easy to do like, just like be like, oh yeah, 20% chance of that, and then kind of see what happens and whether it's fun. I forgive you. So a concrete example of this is in Winnie's Hole. So Winnie's Hole, great game, you should play it, buy 10 copies. We are Winnie the Pooh and also the Thing, and we are mutating Winnie the Pooh, and at various points we get a choice of mutations, right? Kind of like in Slay the Spire, drawing a card. And a lot of these actions, they depend on previous actions. So for instance, this Spike Storm one inflicts bleed per spike, but if I don't have any spike, that's useless to me, right? So there are synergies that are happening here, and it's theoretically possible if we're drawing these mutations entirely at random for all 3 of them to depend on things that we don't have. And that's a problem. So what we do is we constrain 2 out of the 3 to things that we already have something for, and then we kind of shuffle those 3 options. Players don't kind of notice that we're doing this, but it means that you are guaranteed to never get an entirely broken set of options, right? So we've completely removed from the possibility space that kind of bad draw. And again, this requires you to think about what is a bad draw, what is a good draw. Sorry, my voice is a bit croaky, it's day 3. For more complicated, I guess, sampling, so more like procedural content generation, what we would traditionally call procedural content generation. We can apply invariance essentially by starting off with a state that respects them all, and then only applying modifications that maintain them. So what do I mean by this? For instance, in Solium Infernum, we start with a board that is completely empty, and then we add mountain ranges and rivers, but as we are adding mountain ranges, we never expand them to connect with other mountain ranges, because if we did that, we could cut off a path, and that navigability invariant would be called into question. The original did not do this. So I probably need to explain, this player is going to have a bad time. They can't move anywhere. This is an actual 2009 Solium Infernum map. So, obviously the appeal of this game was limited to masochists. In the invariant, we do, of course, guarantee navigability of the whole map. There cannot be a map that is spawned that is not navigable. We also, because the maps on top of putting you in a box could also put you in a corner of the map with nothing around you that was useful, we guarantee that there are, as in Endless Legend, resources, things to conquer that are near you, that are easy targets. And that's for each player. And we also guarantee that the map has an equal number of, these are kind of neutral places that you can capture that are kind of the objective locations of the game, and we ensure that there is an even number of weak and strong ones. We did this very late in production, so we would actually have some maps that would spawn where all the places of power would be hideously strong and no one would be able to do anything for the first half of the game, which wasn't great. And also a minimum number of access paths to each of the places of power. And that ensures that there's nothing that's kind of impossible to attack because it's like in a cul-de-sac or something. Excuse me. Another one, and this would probably be simpler and more familiar to a lot of people. As I mentioned, there are random events that could occur in the original and in the remake. Players can play them at their discretion, so it's always personal. But a lot of games have this kind of random event draw type system. Obviously, as developers, we don't want the same event to come up over and over again. But we also don't want certain disruptive events to occur too early before players have the means at their disposal to actually deal with them. Because that would once again stall the game. It would be really slow, it wouldn't get started. And so, we simply use a draw without replacement. Now, I'm going to be coming back to what this means, but it essentially means a deck of cards as opposed to a dice roll. When an event has been drawn from that deck, it doesn't go back in until it's used or discarded, which means that it's not going to come back an arbitrary number of times. And also, we hold back certain events for the first few turns, so we're sort of gradually shuffling events into the deck as we go along. Because we did have problems with this. We would have this angel that would come down on turn one, and that would just be like, well, this game is going to suck because no one's going to have an army, and we're just going to be sitting there waiting for them to go back to heaven and leave us alone. So a more complicated example, much like the shop in Lethal Company, pretty much everything in Solium Infernum comes from the bazaar. You buy your armies, you buy your magical items, you buy everything from the bazaar. You're competing with other players to buy stuff. And this is restocked by sampling a random variable, which is a fancy way of saying, if I buy the plague bearers, I'm going to draw another item of the same type to replace them. We had problems with this initially, essentially because sometimes the shop would be initialized with only super expensive stuff in it, which once again would lead to the game stalling because no one would be able to afford it until 2 hours into the game. But also there's a tendency for people to buy the cheap stuff. And so if you are redrawing new items entirely at random, cheap stuff gets bought, expensive stuff doesn't get bought, which will inexorably lead to stuff being expensive, right? And also, we have things in the other categories like praetors, where there are different types of praetors, right? There are duelists, and there are non-duelists. And someone might buy a duelist, and then there'd be no duelist on the shop ever. And everyone else would be unable to duel. I think that's the, yeah. So we solved this problem by essentially writing a series of queries that would constrain items that could appear in any given slot. This, for instance, is the bargain bin slot. It has really cheap items in it. Each of the categories up the top there have a different set of queries that apply to different slots. So for instance, the praetor, there's always a cheap one, there's always an expensive one, there's always a duelist, there's always an administrator. The duelist might also be cheap, so you would have 2 cheap ones. And the positions of the slots are randomized. And what's interesting about this is it's not super random, it's very kind of controlled, and yet players don't notice. There is no theory crafting in the community where people are like, oh, there's always a cheap one. It feels better, but people don't really notice it, which is the best kind of design. So yeah, the takeaway here is, we need to do our job. We need to think about what is a good and a bad draw. Often a draw will directly lead to a game situation. And, a poorly constrained stochastic variable can lead to a game situation that doesn't have any of those heuristics that we mentioned before, the choice, the satisfaction, any of that stuff. Don't make it unlikely when it should be impossible. There's a tendency to say, oh, I had a bad draw, I'm just going to make that kind of thing less likely, and that'll be fine. The law of large numbers is not on your side. What I mean by that is any specific player won't be sampling these variables enough time to see justice be done and RNG as a smile upon them. But with enough players playing, someone somewhere is going to get a terrible draw, right? So the law of large numbers is actually working against us. Okay, audience participation time. Sorry, it's Wednesday. I apologize in advance. All right, I'm going to need a show of hands here. I'm going to be flipping 3 coins. Which of these 2 results is more likely to occur? Heads, 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 or heads, heads, tails? So hands up for heads, heads, heads. Hands up for heads, heads, tails. That exact sequence. That exact sequence of 3. So if that changed your mind, I'm sorry if I trapped you. Who thinks they're both equally likely? Okay, yeah, it's a freaking audience of game designers. Yeah, so they are both equally likely to occur. There is one instance of heads, heads, heads. There is one instance of heads, heads, tails. All right, round 2. Sorry, I'll let you look at that for a moment longer. But yeah, these are the 8 possible ways of flipping, the 8 possible sequences of 3 coin flips. Okay, audience participation, round 2. I'm flipping a coin 3 times. Which result is more likely to occur at least once? Heads, heads, or heads, tails? All right, hands up for heads, heads. Hands up for heads, tails. And who thinks they're both equally likely? Gotcha. Heads, heads. 3 out of 8. Because 2 of them are up in here. Yeah, it's a sneaky one there. And heads, tails, 4 out of 8. What's interesting is the intuition that people had on the first question was to prefer the one with alternation. That is to say, the sequence had a change of heads to tails or tails to heads. This is what's called the alternation bias. It's a very well-studied kind of human cognitive bias. It's generally seen as a sign of belief in the gambler's fallacy, which is that coins can remember what they previously flipped. But actually, even people who don't believe in the gambler's fallacy explicitly, and I'm sure no one here does, please, I hope. Humans will still tend, when we are asked to generate a random sequence of coin flips, tend to change the face from one to the next more than 50% of the time. So we have a bias towards alternation. That's kind of interesting. Here's a scientific paper from 2009. I would recommend that you read it. Well, what's kind of interesting is that they suggest that this bias towards alternation is actually adaptive, given the fact that we are not immortal. So here, for instance, I'm going to highlight this kind of, the one that feels unlikely, right? The heads, 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 heads. And this is non-occurrence probability. Okay, so this is looking for a sequence of 4 within a global sequence of 10, 15, 20. And we can see that as we get towards 1,000, right, they're all dropping to effectively 0. But when we have a finite sequence within a slightly longer finite sequence, the sequence of heads is actually a lot less likely to come up. Or rather, all of the instances of that sequence will come up within the same global sequence. And so what they conclude from this is that given finite sampling, so not the law of large numbers, our intuition is actually correct. Like normally in a talk about randomness, I would get all smug and be like, oh, players don't understand random, what fools. But actually, this paper, the 2009 one, there's a 2017 one called Who Believes in the Gambler's Fallacy that I would recommend as well. Real brain-melting stuff, and I'm not going to be able to explain it in this talk because I've only got not many minutes left. But to give you a kind of game example of this, given 2 items that give me the same amount of, say, damage per second, it's actually rational to pick consistent damage over something that's very swingy, because again, the law of large numbers isn't really going to apply to any given individual player. I may die or get bored before I see RNGs smile upon me. Another interesting result from this study, sorry, more charts. Now, I talked about sampling without replacement before. Essentially, it's been shown that human beings tend to assume that all sampling is without replacement. That is to say, we don't really understand dice. We think of everything as a deck of cards. We think that if we've had a 6, the 6 has been removed from the bag of possible numbers that can come up on the dice. This is actually comparing mathematically, right? Trying to find, so let's say we're drawing red and black balls from a bag, or we're getting red or black on a roulette wheel, okay? This is the roulette wheel, okay? So we've got 20 samples looking for a sequence of reds, and here we are using a bag of 2,000, a bag of 200, a bag of 50, a bag of 30, and we're doing 20 samples within that. These charts look very similar. And so there is a kind of justification. If you are a mortal, you're only going to be able to sample a finite number of times. You're only going to be able to remember a finite number of those samples. It's actually adaptive to see stochastic variables as bags of results. Again, I'm going over this very quickly. Read the papers. I will provide links to them, or at least to the names. How does this actually help us as game designers? Well, there's yet another paper that you should be familiar with called 7 plus or minus 2 items that essentially studies the capacity for humans to retain or remember a series of kind of unique items, right? And what it shows is that we're able to memorize between 5 and 9, depending on who we are and the circumstances. So what does that mean? Well, probably a 99% chance to hit is too fine a granularity for people to really grok. You would need 100 items in your bag to be able to kind of understand this random draw intuitively, and that may go some way to explaining why people are so frustrated by these kind of results in XCOM, right? Because effectively, you know, let's say we're looking at this as a bag of 10 items. Well, we round this up to 100%, right? So I suppose my takeaway from this would be like, let's avoid very fine granularities of random. I'm thinking in future, I'm just going to use 10%, and I'm going to use no more than 10 possible results in any given, at least in stochastic variables as fundamental to the core loop as this one. So in Solium, we have a similar kind of draw to the hit-miss in XCOM, which is rituals can succeed or fail. And we kind of sidestep this issue in XCOM by hiding the chance of success entirely. We just say it's unlikely, so we use words. And we're also very pessimistic in our wording. So that unlikely could be a 60% chance of success. So we don't want to disappoint people. Also, we do something that XCOM doesn't do, which is we frame the failure of the attacker as a success on the part of the defender. So for instance, we say the ritual was resisted. One of the big factors probably that frustrates people in XCOM is that we see our soldier being entirely incompetent and firing into the sky. 5 minutes? Okay, cool. But rituals are still a source of frustration, and why is that? Well, if we go back to the initial slide that I was talking about, you know, we already have an awful lot of uncertainty here. The chance of success or failure of a ritual is based on a bunch of attributes and items that the defender has that we are not able to see. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty around what will my opponent do, but also like what do they have at their disposal. Probably there is enough uncertainty here already that we don't need randomness on top of that. So look, if I were to do this game again, and I'd love to one day, I'd probably change a lot of stuff, but one of the things I would change, we could use a draw with replacement. We didn't do that for rituals, so it was just a dice roll, not drawing kind of hits or misses from a deck of cards. But I would probably cut random number generation entirely from rituals because it's not necessary. There is enough uncertainty in the system already. Okay, another example of this. There are 4 different types of resources in Solium Infernum. When we draw new resources, we get a bunch of them at random, kind of like drawing cards from a deck. Initially, it wasn't a deck of cards, though. It was entirely random, and sometimes people would go many, many turns without getting the resource that they needed. And it was very frustrating. People get fixated on buying a given item, and they just wouldn't be able to afford it. Changing this to a deck of types, so the deck has 12 cards in it, 4 souls, 3 darkness, 3 hellfire, 3 ichor, which means that, you know, you're never waiting too long before a given resource comes back. And that made the game feel so much better, once again, for reasons people couldn't quite put their finger on. You know, no one identified explicitly like, oh, this is why it feels better. It just ran more smoothly. And again, this is the kind of change that we like. So look, I mean, there's a visible spectrum of light. There's an audible spectrum of sound, and there is kind of like a visible spectrum of entropy, of randomness as well. Like, we wouldn't put ultraviolet light in our game, so why are we putting random or stochastic variables that have kind of infinite entropy? Like you know, basically we should be using decks of cards, not dice, is my takeaway. And this is an accessibility concern as well, you know. And again, accessibility is for everyone. You know, you can improve cognitive accessibility, and then someone who is tired after a long day looking after their kids or something will be able to play your game more easily. Some caveats around this one. I got really excited about the tribute draw one. I was like, let's make everything a smart draw. Let's put smart random everywhere. So this is a kind of little, almost like a completion minigame. I need to collect all 3 fragments of this given item, this manuscript, before I can use it. And manuscripts are also drawn at random. And so initially I biased the draw towards completing things that you had partially completed. This ended up being a very bad idea because a lot of the time people just end up with fragments they don't want. And the game is kind of saying, hey, I saw that you had this fragment, here's more. And you're like, no, stop doing this to me. Also, it will inflate the size of your saves to use, you know, decks everywhere rather than cards, and it also creates a lot of complexity and errors potentially. And save size does matter if you're paying for the game's network infrastructure, as we were. So yeah, let's tile this off before I run out of time. Sorry. So game systems can be seen as procedural content generators. What they generate is game situations, and we looked at a few of the heuristics for evaluating a good game situation. Uncertainty being one of them. We've looked at how uncertainty underpins the epistemological cycle. We need a balanced kind of amount of uncertainty to avoid grind or button mashing. Stochastic variables are just one source of uncertainty among many. You know, you may not actually need them if you have other sources of uncertainty. And interestingly, they can both contribute to uncertainty around a decision, but they can also directly generate a game situation. So you can often directly remove a bad game situation by looking at your stochastic variables. And one way of forcing the hand of fate is to think in terms of invariance. Again, this involves thinking about what is a good or a bad result in advance. But that is fundamentally what game design is about, like understanding, what is it? You got your goals, your guidelines, all the good stuff Kidney was talking about yesterday. And yeah, humans tend to assume that all draws are without replacement. And this is actually kind of adaptive, which is interesting, if you are not immortal. And so, you know, if you lean into that, you can make something that's more comfortable for people. Here's recommended reading list. These slides will all be on my website, so don't worry too much about taking a photo of this. I did promise spreadsheets, so great news. Google Sheets now supports tables and structured references. It does not yet support the implicit intersection operator, so I'm still waiting on that one. I do have some exciting stuff to talk about for the Winnie's whole project around spreadsheets, but that will probably wait until next year. So yeah, we probably don't have much time for questions, but you can grab my slides on the website. I have a slightly older version. I'll put the new one up later. And yeah, feel free to talk to me afterwards. Thank you so much for your time.